One and we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream. I'm your host, Christopher Balkaran. Folks, I come to you today with a real serious question about the future of Canada and where we see ourselves going. There's so many issues that I want to get to in this live, one of which being what our young people are facing today and the stark reality they're facing with just higher rents, higher mortgage rates, just general higher prices, and a very precarious labor market that is almost unprecedented. And I know that sounds very hard to hear, but I feel like the young generation, the Gen Z, they're really going to struggle in the next few years dealing with this reality, potentially longer. So tonight's, and I've pinned this in the chat, so check that out. Youth unemployment. It's still at approximately 15%. It's higher for teenagers, and higher in certain regions. But I want to know from you, because so many of you have talked to me about what you've been going through: higher rents, job precariousness, um, just not enough opportunities, seeing a lot of opportunities go to foreign workers, international students, feeling like you can't get ahead at all, feeling like you're left behind in the country that you love and you grew up in, and that your family has contributed to. So there's a lot of sentiment that people are feeling so disconnected. So in the comments, drop a concrete way the system has failed you this year. Did you lose your job? Did your rent go up? Did you move back home? Are you stuck in the gig economy? Tell me in the comments below, because what I want to do with this information, I want us to keep building out what we see as the best way forward. I think the only way the government understands is by us talking about this openly and getting into the things that the government doesn't want to hear all the time. So, again, drop in the chat. Also, I want to ask you this. This is a really personal question, but I think it's important we get to it. When you look at your life, when you look at the rent and the jobs, the job economy, your savings, tell me in the chat if this past year you felt like you got richer or if you felt like you got poorer. And I know it's a very important question and it's very personal, and feel free to share or not if you don't want to, but it's so important we at least talk about this, because if you look at what our politicians and the media is saying, it's like sometimes I feel like they don't even understand the real hurt and the pain that Canadians are going through every day. So I would really appreciate if you drop in the chat if you feel, again, poorer or richer this year. Tell me about it. Let me know in the chat, and feel free to comment on the pinned comments there. Folks, I want to just talk about one thing with you, and that's youth unemployment. And forgive me, I've got a lot of stats that I want to get to, but there's something that I found in the research that's called scarring. I don't know if a lot of you know about scarring, so let's get into that. So, the federal government's own numbers show that as of October 2025, youth unemployment between 15 to 24 years is around 14.1%. And again, that goes up on in certain regions. One in five teenagers who want a job can't find one. So there are real young people who want a job, but they can't find one. This is what I meant about scarring. Economists have a term for what happens when you start your working life late in a labor market like this. They call it scarring. This means when you graduate or leave school, you're supposed to be building skills, experience, and networks. If that door is not really fully open, you're missing early promotions, accepting lower wages. You're bouncing in between contracts. And as a result, young people who enter the labor market during high unemployment periods can carry an earnings penalty, sometimes 10% or more lower income to cohorts who graduated in better conditions even after the overall economy improves. So you're basically entering a labor market that's more precarious, and chances are your earnings will actually be depressed um, than if you were entering a better labor market condition. Now, I say this because some people seem to think that, um, oh, they're just lazy and they're not working hard enough, or they're not putting in the hours and they're not like trying to get every opportunity. I definitely have experienced that myself. Um, but at the same time, there are structural issues in the labor market that I think is like we're not talking about for young people. And I've mentioned this before with temporary foreign workers. Again, I do think that there's a reason StatsCan does not keep unemployment numbers for temporary foreign workers and international students, because it will kind of defeat the purpose of the whole program if they showed high unemployment amongst temporary foreign workers. They came here to be temporary and they're from abroad and they're here to work. So if there's high unemployment amongst those groups, the government has an issue because the program really doesn't work. But then it runs into the issue of, well, is this an employer driven program or an actual government need program? I say all of that because young people, Canada's young people, are being caught in the crosshairs of this. You know, when youth unemployment is at 15%, let's just round up to 20%. That one in five young people, just think about that number. Like one in five young people are unemployed. I mean, this is very, very much uncharted territory because we haven't seen these numbers in a very long time for such a sustained period of time. And the rippling out effects are pretty well documented. High unemployment amongst young people leads to all types of suicide, depression, anxiety, etc., criminal behavior, even. Okay, so why do I raise all of this? Um, because there's something, and again, I've got some really interesting research I want to share with you. Um, get this, and this number has remained relatively unchanged for the past 10 to 15 years. NEET, NEET, not in employment, education, or training. 12% of youth, 12% of youth aged 15 to 29 were not in employment, education, or training. That's about 924,000 young people from not in school and not actually working. Think about that. I say that, and again, some people might say, "Oh, Christopher, though, that's not that big a number." For a population of 40 million, that's a big number. That's a really big number. Because, of the 40 million, like, obviously it's not all 40 million working, but the fact that 924,000 young people across Canada are not in employment, they're not in education, they're not in a training program, that tells me a lot. And researchers, economists have seen that when you're young and you're not in employment, not in education, not in training, you're missing out on key years where you could be developing those skills. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do think that, and forgive me, I'm sure there are government programs out there for young people, but it's not making a difference when it comes to the NEET, the not in education, employment, or training. If you look at the numbers for the past 10 to 15 years, it's been relatively unchanged. And again, I just think of that as a major concern now because I think NEET would be relatively okay in good economic times with a slightly pricey housing market, because chances are unemployment's pretty low, and you could find a job and you could save your money and you could buy a house. Like all of the coulds are there still. But NEET in this economy where we're seeing higher levels of unemployment, where we're seeing a housing market that's topsy turvy at best, um, where Gen Z feels completely priced out of the market because the stress tests are so rigorous now that, someone coming out of school, they're not going to afford it. I don't say all of this to be doom and gloom, but I think if you're not in education, you're not in employment, you're not in training right now in the economy, I think that financial scarring, that employment scarring, I think is much more pronounced than it may ever be, because that means that the ability for you to differentiate yourself in the market and get a job becomes that much harder. So I'm going to leave you with that to see what you think about NEET and the number that 924,000 young Canadians are not in employment, not in education, and not in training. So I just want to mention that because it's such an important stat and something that, again, I don't think our leaders are talking about. One thing I've mentioned on my channel quite repeatedly, and some have like kind of said, this is the reality, but it's the delayed adulthood. That's a big issue. We know that Gen Z is, I think, the only generation that's delaying so many life choices to much later in life. Now, look, I'm not one to throw rocks, right? Like, I am not married, I don't have kids. So, you know, it's not like I'm saying, like, haha, I'm married with kids and I live on my own. You should do the same. I do live on my own, but it's one of the things where I feel like um, we've never seen this with the generation delaying so much all at once. So I'm going to share some stats with you. 35% of Canadians aged 20 to 34 are living with at least one parent. Now, 35%, you might think that that's a high number. It's actually very similar to the early 2000s when it was about 30%. So it's not a dramatic increase. But in some provinces where we again see higher housing prices, that number jumps. In Ontario, it's 42%. So that it's much more pronounced in provinces where we're seeing extremely high housing costs. Um, Now, the 42% in Ontario could also be due to the large South Asian community that has been coming into Ontario over the past 15 years, where it's very socially and culturally accepted for South Asian families to live together and to live multiple generations together under one roof. But suppressing household formation is something that we should be talking about because this does lead to other issues. We know this. So I'm going to share some stats with you if I think I have it. Um, but chances are, if you delay adulthood decisions, there's that sense of independence, that sense of well-being, the sense of I'm working towards something that may be missing. And when those things are missing, then lack of purpose starts like falling by the wayside a little bit. And we all know what happens when you lack a sense of purpose and worth. Um, so we're seeing that this is happening. I want to briefly go back to the South Asian example for a second because I think that and we'll get into this in the next section, but I think that the intergenerational families living together has been taken to quite the extreme in some parts of Brampton, Ontario, where we see large South Asian populations, communities. But of course, not everyone can afford, $2,000 rent downtown, or wherever. So they live in they cut up a basement and throw up a rooming house, and suddenly there's multiple generations living together. But the house was never set up for that many people using the facilities and the electricity, etc. And so it becomes a big issue. Um, Couples are staying together in relationships. Here's something else that's something interesting that I came across. Many are staying in relationships out of necessity, not because they like each other, but because they simply can't afford to live apart, which is very interesting. Again, I'm going to do some more research on that. But if you are Gen Z and you are in a relationship and you feel like you're stuck, Drop that in the comments. I'd love to know. And the reason why is because I wonder how many Gen Z are in relationships out of necessity because of the housing market, not because they actually like the person. Let me know what you think in the comments section. Um, so I just want to say, like, it's not a personal failure. And I think that's something that people get this confused with. They think that if I'm not moved out by the time I'm 19, 20 years old, I'm a failure. And, this isn't 1980s, 1990s Canada. This is 2025. And it is very hard for young people to move out, let alone do things on their own. Um, so I just want to mention that because rents are not cheap. And I wanted to raise with you all the city of Brampton. Now, I've covered the residential rental licensing pilot, RRL, that the city of Brampton is doing. The reason they're doing this is because they've noticed that illegal rooming houses account for approximately 100,000 people in Brampton, a city of, I think, 700,000, I think, maybe more. That's a sizable percentage of all residents of Brampton. And that lets me know that um, there's something else going on here because, it's when these houses are cut up for students or families, they change the fire codes, they change the sprinkler systems, they change the windows. And unfortunately, as we saw a few weeks ago, tragedy can unfold, fires can happen, and firefighters wouldn't be able to get individuals because they're trapped in their part of the basement, even though the place was never set up for that. And that's the real tragedy of all of this, that there's lives being lost behind these shoddy landlords and the types of equipment and the way they're dividing up the houses. So I say all of this because in January 2024, the city launched the residential rental licensing pilot in wards 1, 3, 4, 5, and 7. And it was to require landlords with 4 or fewer rental units to get a license so that they can inspect for the fire code, building code, and any other safety issues. There were thousands of inspections and hundreds of penalty notices. And it just shows that the city knows what's going on and they're trying to crack down on it. Um, and so I think what's really important here is when the city cracks down on these illegal or unsafe units, people don't really disappear. They just figure out other ways to get their living arrangements figured out, if that makes sense. And I think that's an issue. But the bigger issue here to me is that there's this pipeline of South Asian temporary foreign workers that are coming here that have access to very inexpensive housing, like few $100 for a room in someone's basement. I mean, this is how this economy is functioning. And it's scary because again, these temporary foreign workers, these young people from India, they're competing for the same jobs as Canadians. And I wouldn't even say that they're competing. I feel like there's jobs set up for them as soon as they arrive. So I want to ask you this. If Brampton cleans up every illegal basement tomorrow and nothing else changes, where do you think all these tenants go? And I think what happens is they'll find another place to room out of. Maybe further away, but somewhere, because that's the only way this can actually work. And I think the government knows this. I think the government knows that illegal rooming houses are going to happen because I've always wondered, like, how does the government not know? You know what I mean? Like, how does the government put in these additional stress tests for mortgages? They obviously see how rents are going. I mean, there might be some dips, but generally speaking, they know how this is going, and they know that they're bringing in over 1 million temporary foreign workers. Where are they all going to go? They can't afford rent. They can't afford like at a condo. They can't build condos fast enough, even if they could afford it. Um, so where are they gonna go? They have to go into a rooming house. That's the only way this works. Like, you think about this, and I'm trying to be as open-minded here, but, like, if the government, which it did between 2015 to, like, now, basically, 2024, they knew that when they allowed so many people in, they didn't have any there's no plan for housing for these people. So and post-secondary schools do not have to provide student housing. So illegal rooming houses had to come up as an option for these people. They can't afford anything else. And so the illegal rooming houses boom would have to happen because where else are hundreds of thousands of people going to live? And again, their only choice are these rooming houses. I'm going off on a tangent, but I think you see what I see, so I think that's important. Okay. So I say all of this because um I just want us to talk about something that I'm really concerned about. Canada is one of the most educated countries in the world. According to the OECD, I think we're like in the top 3 or 4, something like that. I can't remember the exact number. I think we're actually the most educated in the G7. And yet I see this like massive weakness in our economy. I was listening to actually funny enough, I was listening to Charlie Munger on YouTube, and the narrator said that, Charlie would say that like PhDs and academics would struggle with money and personal finance. So he learned that being good with personal finance had nothing to do with your education level because it's emotional driven. You want the new car, you want the new house, you want the new gadget because there's an emotion connected to it. But if you can control those emotions, you can become much more disciplined in your savings. But what I see in our country is productivity weakness driven by everything I've discussed already. Just a precarious labor market that's jobs that are not going to Canadians, Canadians that are priced out of their own communities. I mean, this is a real issue. Gen Z is delaying adulthood. They're not moving out, obviously, and I'm not saying that to be dismissive because it's a real housing market out there. But when I see people with, like, multiple degrees working in the gig economy, that's labor market weakness. We haven't been able to translate what they did in school to a proper job, and that's concerning to me. It's concerning to me when the government brings in so many temporary foreign workers, filling the jobs that young Canadians, 16, 17, 18, should be filling. It concerns me because this is a delay in their development. And I don't know what those kids are doing, but I know that many of them, 1 in 5 in some cases, are unemployed. And there's over 900,000 young people who are not in education, employment, or training. So that tells me that there's this labor market scarring where they're not developing their skills fast enough to compete at a younger age. And so a stable job that uses your skills, a home you can realistically afford to move in before 35, they're gone. They're completely gone. And this is why I'm so concerned about Gen Z, because if you remove those things, if you delay big life decisions, and I mentioned in a previous video about medical assistance in dying, I can see why Gen Z will feel even more disconnected from our reality here. Like, they'll just wonder, "What's going on? I'm not part of this economy at all." So, I wanna leave that there with you because I'm curious to know what you think can fix Canada, if anything. Um, and I'm curious to know what you think about the data that I've shared. I think it's very interesting to see, and I think that there's a lot more to unpack here. So, I'll leave it at that. It's like I'm 30 minutes in, so you're probably sick and tired of hearing from me too. But drop a like, comment, let me know what you think. Like, share, subscribe. Again, I think this is a place where I'm going to keep covering these tough topics because it's really hard to unpack them. And I think it needs a bit more of a deep dive from me. So stay tuned for more content on this. A lot more to come, but I'll leave it there and I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this stream, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye for now.